Good morning, everyone. My name is Caris Hughes. I'm the Communications Manager and Impact Researcher in Léargas, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this launch of the Impact and Experience of Foreign Languages in the Context of Erasmus Plus in all education sectors in Ireland by Dr. Britta C Jung. We're joined today by a very wide group of colleagues, including members of the European Commission, the European Parliament, Department of Education, and you're all very welcome. So Léargas is one of the two national agencies in Ireland for Erasmus Plus, along with the Higher Education Authority. And Erasmus Plus, for anyone who might not know, is the EU programme for education, training, youth and sport, and it's been running since 2014. European mobility is really one of the pillars of Erasmus Plus, and thousands of people from Ireland have been able to train, to study, to volunteer, or to get work experience in other countries as part of the programme. So exposure to new languages and to different language environments is really intrinsic to Erasmus Plus. And so we wanted to work together with our friends and colleagues in the Higher Education Authority to understand how this exposure to new language environments has influenced attitudes to language learning in Ireland. This is particularly in light of the government strategy for foreign languages, Languages Connect. We co-commissioned this research into the subject through the Irish Research Council, and we were delighted to be connected with Britta, Dr. Britta C Jung, from University College Dublin. Britta has a very strong humanities and languages background, and she's herself a highly mobile person, having worked and studied in the Netherlands, in her native Germany, and here in Ireland. So Britta has applied her expertise and her interest in the subject to produce a really comprehensive and revealing study, which is also quite unique in considering all fields of Erasmus+, that's adult education, higher education, school education, vocational education and training, and youth. And the study will certainly inform our own practices in Léargas as we support people to take part in Erasmus+, and I'm sure it will inform other practitioners in languages and in universities also. So I'll introduce you to my colleague and to the author of this study, Dr. Britta Jung.
I would like, obviously, to thank the HEA, Léargas, and everybody at the Irish Research Council to support me throughout this study, and to begin with, the trust they put in me in examining this rather complex yet extremely rewarding issue. Today, for the launch of the study, I would like you to briefly walk you through some of the key findings of the study and summarize them. There are many more. As I said, it's quite a complex issue. And if they come up in the question, or if you have questions about something, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A. And even if you read the study afterwards, please feel free to drop me an email. I'm always happy to answer them as I find the time to go along and to discuss it further. So as the title already suggests of the study is examining the impact and experience of foreign languages on participants of Erasmus in all education sectors. And as Kara says, that includes adult education, higher education, school education, vocational training, and youth. And a second corollary objective of this study was also to investigate the awareness and attitudes towards foreign languages and foreign language learning in Ireland. Because if we talk about what happens abroad when people are on Erasmus mobilities, we also need to consider their previous experiences with language learning. The study is situated in the broader context of the government's Action Plan for Education 2016 and 19, and the subsequent strategy for foreign languages in education, Languages Connect, as Kara's already mentioned, and also in the EU's language policies, and most notably the key competences for lifelong learning, and the European Council's Barcelona objective of Mother Tongue +2, which pushes for all young people to be able to learn 2 additional languages to their mother tongue. And of course, as we are living in a bilingual country by nature, also the 20-year strategy for the Irish language, 2010 to 2020, and the and the action plan, the recently launched action plan for that 20-year strategy also play a role. The study itself employs a mixed methodology and combines a nationwide anonymous online survey, as well as 19 in-depth interviews of former participants and administrators of the EU Plus program in Ireland. Its key contributions lie firstly in this mixed methodology design, which provides both a panoramic view as well as a zooming in into lived experiences of the participants abroad. Another key contribution is the inclusion of data from all education sectors, as Karis has already mentioned, as existing studies, particularly on the nexus of language learning in the context of Erasmus Plus, have almost exclusively focused on higher education, as people tend to stay abroad longer in this particular sector. So, who are the subjects of this study? As I said, the quantitative data was collected through a nationwide online survey that was anonymous, and I've received 609 responses by past, present, and future Erasmus participants. That is, people who went on Erasmus Plus during the current iteration from 2014 or were planning to do until 2020. The interviewees itself were rather selected based on institutional and geographical spread. You see a little map here in one of the slides where you have a nice spread where the individual participants went. Most of them participated in Erasmus under Key Action 1, that is the mobility of individuals. A few of them more to form strategic partnerships, so Key Action 2. And there is one interviewee who provided a counter perspective, who is an European volunteer, service volunteer, a non-Irish national who came to Ireland to work here in a youth project for 1 year and go away. So that's a bit the outsider perspective. The interviewees themselves have varying degrees of experience with Erasmus Plus, and ranging from one mobility of a few days up to 5 mobilities. And they have vastly different experiences in language learning. Several of the interviewees also have a migratory background and are multilingual by heritage, through their heritage language. So what are the findings? Generally speaking, the study once again highlights that the use of language does not only refer to the general ability to speak it, but also involves a combination of ability, opportunity, and positive attitude. It also highlights that ties somewhat to the previous point, that we generally need to pay more attention to the affectual or emotional dimension of language learning when we talk about how we want to improve the language teaching and learning here in Ireland. As you will see later on, words like perception or feeling play a major part in the responses of the survey respondents as well as the interviewees. Concretely, that means we need to think about language learning more holistically. Where do foreign languages, English, Irish, literacy, but also general cultural studies, history, and so on overlap? Where can we find common denominators and build onto each other? Not so much to think about language learning as a separate part in itself. We also need to explore ways to provide learners with more agency, both in the learning process, but also in the selection of the language itself, the selection of the language they are about to learn. Playing into this is the necessity to foster a feeling of belonging to the language community, to not have it as a mere academic subject, but to actively engage with the language and make it part of a communal sphere, digitally, virtually, as well as in the real world. considering the global status of English as a lingua franca, it is also really important to foster communicative empathy toward non-native speakers and to raise the awareness that, yes, a lot of people around the world do indeed speak English, but there are real tangible barriers and limitations to that notion. Another important challenge then is to instill more confidence in Irish language learners in their own skills, as well as in those of their teachers. And I will get back to that a bit later on. And finally, I think we need to find a way to manage the learners' expectations regarding their own learning process. It is like learning a language takes a long time. It is a continuous effort and involves a lot of mistakes, making a lot of mistakes and learning from them. And that is somewhat contrary to our current instant gratification culture. It's not easy to learn a language, and that is something that needs to be driven home again and again. Given that the tiniest things might support or indeed throw a learner off their language learning, I found it quite interesting that one of the interviewees has described language learning in terms of a journey that never ends, a journey that some people might not be on themselves. They're simply not interested in learning a language, but which nevertheless impacts the journey of others, either by providing them with emotional, financial, institutional resources, or by training them. TM, that's the interviewee, said the following, and I quote, "Like stopping the offering of a language model in this context is just terrible. Or the things have happened where people offer a language, but only on 5 programs and at 3 hours on a Friday afternoon. So you can do languages while everybody else goes down to the pub. That's like offering your violin lessons to a child, but it's on a Sunday morning when they want to sleep in. And painting languages in a bad light, or saying it's hard, like German is so hard and Spanish is so easy. You hear all this stuff and you know it's wrong, but people are so willing to believe it. So even if people are not necessarily meaning it coming from a bad point in what they say, their tiniest kind of thing, tiniest negative or positive comment might influence it, or structural changes might influence it. And we have to be very careful about this in the future. So this is the general notions I would like to put before I'm now moving to more specific kind of findings. And I will firstly focus on, again, general findings that concern more the language practice and language learning in Ireland. And then I will then introduce you to the findings relating to the Erasmus Plus experience more specifically after that. Contrary to the popular belief that languages are difficult and that the Irish are just not good at learning languages, what I frequently hear, there's actually a great linguistic curiosity among the Irish, and particularly the Irish participants. They're interested in anything from minority languages and more exotic languages. One of the interviewees was really interested in learning Kalaallisut. I had to look it up. It's one of the native tongues of Greenland. And then obviously to languages with what has been referred to in reference to Pierre Bourdieu's as larger linguistic capitals. So this would be the major world languages. English is one of them, but obviously Irish participants do speak it. But think about German or Spanish, French, more recently Chinese as well. We see a big push there. There are, however, concerns around the achievability of these languages or learning these languages. And they are mostly centered around time constraints and the nature of the learning process. So the people responding to this study or being interviewed in the study, they're well aware that learning a language is not an instant gratification, that it takes time and it takes continuous effort. And this is why they might not even get started on that journey to refer back to TM, or why they are not making the progress they would like to see. Despite this curiosity and by and large positive learning experience, there is, however, also a lack of interest in formal and higher level qualifications. One of the reasons for this seems to be that most foreign language encounters do take place in the private sphere and not in the workplace. So there is a disconnect between what we hear from the interest groups in the business community, who say we need more modern language speakers, foreign language speakers, we have the jobs, and the experience of Irish in these jobs or in the economy, who say, well, I know a language, but I'm hardly using my foreign language capacity. Again, there are different reasons for that. However, there is, I would, just to simplify it, there is some sort of vicious circle behind it, and that companies, because they cannot find the people with the right qualifications and the right abilities, tend to bring in non-Irish nationals from continental Europe to fill positions and who have to have the good language skills. So fewer here need to do the foreign languages in the workplace. And that then affects, again, the demand, and they don't see the demand in learning the languages and going up to a qualifications. They see languages more as something I do for myself privately. Overwhelming majority of participants do, however, enjoy learning languages. This is what I already said. And both inside and outside of school. The main reason provided by them for not using then their existing language competences outside is the perceived lack of proficiency. They think they are not proficient enough to actually employ what they've learned outside the classroom. And there is, and I'm only touching very briefly on an attitudinal difference between Irish participants and Irish participants with a migratory background. With the latter perceiving themselves as belonging to a continuously evolving language community. So they use whatever little they might have in a specific language and apply it outside, regardless of mistakes. They just go for it. They're building on and transferring knowledge from other languages to the one they are speaking there. They're switching between languages, and they're less afraid to make mistakes. And this is a notable difference between participants who don't have this bilingual background from outside languages. You do see it to some extent also in Irish participants who went to a Gael school, who are less afraid to actually use what they have outside. It doesn't feature as strongly in there. Another important factor in the language learning is the personal connection a learner has with a language. So that's quite a central point, actually. And that personal connection with a language can be due to a person, a family member, heritage language plays in that, friends, family friends, but also a deep interest in specific aspects of a culture. One of the interviewees, for example, has a deep interest in Japanese anime and manga, and that has driven them to move forward to learn Japanese and really going for it. The learning process is then highly dependent on encouragement and positive role models. If you see somebody in your world who employs their languages outside, you're more likely to do so. If you see somebody who is open to other languages, who engages with them and other cultures, you're more likely to do so. And then to that extent, it's also the quality enthusiasm of the teacher and the language teaching they provide or provided. Again, this is also the personal connection. This person can also obviously be a teacher. Learners, and this is where it turns negative, learners do pick up if the teacher is linguistically and interculturally competent, if they know the other culture, if they know the language, and they will pick up on it. If they feel not confident, if they're not confident in that, they are not very confident in what they're learning and less likely to move forward. So it's paramount to increase or ensure the competence and the confidence of the teachers themselves as well. Interestingly, we seem currently in danger of creating and perpetuating two new myths. And one of them concerns that we seem to be starting the that only those who start learning a language early can achieve proficiency. And this seems to be based or filtered down from the scholarship, from the academic consensus, that the earlier you start learning a language, the better it is, because the easier you build it up. However, it seems to be, to some of the respondents, kind of a cop-out then. It's like, I didn't start when I was 4 years old, so I have no chance to achieve it. So this is something, yes, the academic consensus is there, but there needs to be a counter-narrative that it's never too late to get started on learning a language and that you can actually achieve proficiency in it. The second myth, which I also find quite interesting, is that only native speakers make good language teachers. That was a common thread throughout the interviews, and a lot of anecdotes came up around it. People praising their teachers, that they found they had great competence and confidence, and they instilled like a passion for the language, always made sure, or most of them made sure, to stress that they were native speakers of that language. And only very few had like teachers who were non-native speakers who achieved a similar kind of authority about the language. So the native speaker status grants the teacher authority and pushes that further. And that is really a dangerous myth to create, because obviously there are a lot of excellent language teachers around in Ireland who just needs to be supported. So just a really quick, and there is more in the study about that, the language provision in Irish schools and post-secondary education not only lacks diversity, but also often agency, with many learners not being able to choose the language or pursue it further, the language they want, the language they might be interested in due to the personal connection. And then another point is, compared to European counterparts, the language selection in Ireland's third level institution remains somewhat limited, continuing the focus of the secondary education on French, German, and Spanish, to some extent Italian, and more recently Chinese. Trinity College and UCC have by and far the largest selection, also with a very strong lifelong learning programs around these, and also offering minority languages. However, oftentimes ab initio options are lacking in institutions, and rigid curricula do not allow for extra classes, particularly people I heard in the interviews saying they had to drop languages even though they were interested in pursuing them further, but there was just not the capacity to do so. Institutes of technology, again, are dropping languages quite significantly because of the capacity there. And there are a lot of other factors that I mentioned in this context, but they are more in the study, or if you have questions about them, you can ask me about that later. I just wanted to give you some interview excerpts, some examples to underpin these issues. Okay, wait, this panel is blocking me. So GM, who is in higher education, said, "It was chosen for me. The year I entered school, that entire year was German. And the previous year was German. Then the next 2 years were French. It was just the way they organized it in school. I had no choice in which language to pick. Everybody did German that year. It wasn't offered." In this case, in this particular case for GM, it turned out quite well, because they moved on to study German actually later on, and however, it was chosen for him. Then we have JB from the vocational training sector. Spanish, I didn't really enjoy it. I just did it because I had to do it. Irish, I kind of liked. I like speaking Irish and stuff like that. The difference is that I care about one, the language of the island. The other one I did because other people told me I had to do. And then as a counterpoint, PS said, I did Spanish in secondary school for 5 years and I really enjoyed it. It was one of my favorite subjects, and I also visited Spain before a few times. I liked the culture and I wanted to see more and learn more. So two very different perspectives, but it again highlights the personal connection each of them has to specific languages. And then finally, YT from the youth sector says, a lot of students complained about teachers, not just to each other, but also to the school, because some teachers didn't come into school for long periods of time because of personal reasons. So students started lacking in their French. So it's really important to have the teacher emphasize the learning of the language, because some of them would encourage learning the language, like reading in French outside of school hours. Others would encourage just to learn exactly what was on the piece of paper. So that's why I don't remember anyone saying, my next class is French, I can't wait. YT then also has later on in the study some reflections about the leaving certificate and the way languages are examined. He praises Irish in this instance, which is more based on free speaking and communication, while he felt that his French class was more about rote learning. And YT is somebody with a migratory background. He came to Ireland a few years ago when he was, I think, 12 years old. And he is quite adept at learning languages. He transfers languages. He's a native speaker of Russian, but he engages with all sorts of languages through his work as well. And recently picked up some Portuguese in this communicative empathy effort to talk more with his workmates during his job, who are from Brazil. So let's turn to the key findings of the study in relation to Erasmus Plus more. And again, there were many more aspects to talk about, and I've just took out some I feel are quite important. Participating in Erasmus creates an awareness of existing language barriers and instills confidence in how to handle them, particularly to people who have never experienced it before. I saw that particularly in the youth sector with youth who were from a socioeconomic disadvantaged background who went to Romania, who've never traveled abroad, certainly not in a non-English speaking country, and who were quite challenged in the interaction. And it took a lot of mediation from the project leaders to get the youth, both they went to Romania from the Romanian side, not so much because they're more used to it, but the Irish youth to engage and not shutting down through this kind of exchange. So going abroad helps to deconstruct the myth that English is enough, which is quite often heard. It illustrates the geographical, political, social, educational, generational limits of English as a lingua franca quite drastically. Interviewees were really surprised to learn who can and who can't speak English, and in quite surprising levels. From high-ranking university management in Austria who couldn't communicate fluently in English, to younger people who come from Eastern Europe who might have learned German as a first foreign language rather than English. They learn, again, this communicative empathy. They also learn the effort that goes into the non-native speakers speaking English. They might be tired too. They see that they might be tired too, and that it takes a lot of effort to continuously, fluently react in English in certain circumstances. So they're more open, and even if they try just a little bit to move forward, the expectations are different, and that's an important shift in the respect and in the intercultural exchange. Erasmus also creates a unique multi- and plurilingual space in which learners get to explore their whole linguistic repertoire, as well as new languages. And this is an interesting kind of topic, particularly, this particularly happens in the higher education sector because with undergrad or with students' mobilities because of the length of the study, but also with smaller exchanges. And it's quite an interesting thing because it goes against everything we think about when we send students abroad to study a language, that we want the immersive effect, to speak as much of that language as possible. However, this is not necessarily the case. Erasmus Plus, in the meantime, since its beginnings, has morphed into an international, intercultural space, transcultural space, where a lot of languages happen at the same time. And as you can see in the graph below, participants often improve their language competence in more than one language. Obviously, speaking the target language itself has the biggest effect, but there's more languages happening because they're in this multilingual space. And interestingly, it also affects the own English competencies. English improves quite drastically. Another interesting point I found was that Erasmus provides also a space to actively engage with Irish, particularly in the context of mobilities in Eastern Europe and in areas with minority languages. So groups that went to Eastern Europe who have their own history of language oppression and shifting there, they just really struggled with it, to understand what happened in Irish, and Irish participants then start to appreciate Irish more, they explore it more, they think about it more, and they use it more. So I give you some example about this multi and plurilingualism. We made it our aim to live with international students when we got our accommodation. We knew we were in an English-speaking country, but because it was Erasmus, we wanted that. I lived with a girl from Denmark and a guy from Spain, then someone from Wales as well. It was really interesting because my Spanish friend was learning English, so I would help her with her English on projects. Then with the French friends, I had studied French in secondary school, so I got to use a little bit of that. The Spanish were trying to get us to learn Spanish, and I'm going to see my friend in Spain. I wish I had a little bit more Spanish because I'm going to see her. She sends me messages with some Spanish. That's SR. Then here, ELM works in the school education, in a school sector. She's a teacher in a primary school. So she's talking about primary school students here. They have so much more writing and presentations to do all the time with these Erasmus projects. They're presenting for non-English speakers. So often they think, can I make it simpler? They're simplifying their language as well by taking a look at it and how they're saying it. We often ask them, if you were reading something in a foreign language, would you want a long bit or just a short bit? So they take a big text and they learn to summarize it a bit to make it easier to the people they're presenting to it to understand. Edit. So that's the communicative empathy also being taught and saying things in different ways. And finally here, this is our non-Irish volunteer in Galway. It's very hard to communicate with people speaking another language. And I recognize that even if we learn English, for example, it's not like the native English. When you learn English abroad, if you're speaking European English, you speak different, because the accent is different. Some words you learn are not real words. And a lot of the participants also picked up on that they are not the ultimate authority, or that people, they are an authority, but that the English learners abroad make English their own by now. And there is such a thing as Euro-English. And just because the Irish are native English speakers in this instance doesn't mean that they understand everything that this international community say. So there's language transfer coming in, translanguaging, and that plays into that. So This is now a quote going on the Irish. So this is the youth project going to Romania, I already mentioned. So then the subject of Irish came up. The Romanian group were asking why they don't speak Irish. That's your second language. We were saying that's not the case for most people, and they were horrified. They were saying it's your national language. That was a big thing as part of the second leg of the mobility, as part of the cultural comparison and how we value our own language and traditions. I would say the Irish group got quite emotional, but at the same time kind of let down because they couldn't say, yeah, we do know this language, or even the national anthem. It's in Irish. The Romanians sing their national anthem and we played it off YouTube because we didn't know. They felt quite embarrassed in terms of culture, so they did say next time they're learning the national anthem. So that's something that's really small and funny, but it had a huge impact on them. It's a comparison on how you value culture and traditions and the language of your country. We really couldn't give them an answer. We didn't know the answer. And RR here was really later on in the interview also describing to a great length the continued emotional impact it had. So by seeing how other cultures value their own national language and how they bring it up in the traditions, the youth group started to rethink their own relationship to Irish, which they kind of brushed off beforehand, and started to engage a bit more with it. Not to a great extent, but the first step, and who knows where this one is moving towards. So this slide now I present you is a self-assessment of the survey respondents before and after their mobility in terms of their language skills according to the Common European Framework of Reference. And it illustrates the general improvement of foreign language competences. And is, as you can see, there is quite a dramatic shift. You have to remember, not everybody goes on Erasmus specifically to improve their language skills, particularly outside of higher education. So you have people going on Erasmus for a really short period of time, a few days, for meetings or brief, very specific training course. So obviously their engagement with the language is not as deep as somebody who goes for a semester or two, even if they're not necessarily language students, but they are there over a longer period of time and might even take up language courses on the side. So as you can see, of the people who had no skills before the mobility, that's the blue graph on the left-hand side, 102 out of 140 who said so before maintained that they still have no language skills after the mobility in that particular local language. However, you can see as it moves towards the right, there is like 27 said, well, I did pick up something, and you even have 3 people who said after the mobility, and that's on the very right-hand side, that they are now basically proficient in the language. As it is in self-assessment, there's always room for error there, but this is how they feel and how they perceive their own language skills according to it. The biggest impact seems to be when we think about moving from independent speakers to proficient speakers. And this is, so if we move from B1 and B2 towards like C1 level after the mobility. So the participants already had some language skills before they went, and then in the community, in the interaction, in the immersion, if you want, they picked up more. So this seems to be a really targeted effort to get the fluency, to get the proficiency in, and that it has quite a significant target. And one of the reasons this is happening is that the mobility facilitates an engagement with the languages in a more informal, unregulated setting, and shifting the focus from an exam-based learning culture to a communicative one. It creates or imitates basically what I said earlier about the difference between the participants with a migratory background and those with a non-migratory background. So there's a shift in the perception and how to engage with the language that mirrors now a bit more that of those participants who engage with it more freely. The learners gain agency and start to feel as part of the language community, with plenty of opportunities to engage with other learners as well as with the locals, and they have speaking opportunities. There is less anxiety around using the language in front of peers, which is, by the way, one of the major reasons provided for disliking foreign languages in schools or learning foreign languages in schools. It's the peer pressure and the fear of making a fool of oneself and speaking it, which does not, seem as prevalent a reason among those students who attend a Gael school. And the confidence of the learners increases with regard to their own linguistic skills, but also with regard to themselves in general. They become more confident in the way they carry themselves outside and the way they interact with people, verbally and non-verbally. So I would also like to include some key findings that concern more structural challenges around Erasmus Plus in Ireland. And again, many of them are linked to individual factors I mentioned earlier. One of them is that the higher education sector reports that it occasionally struggles to persuade Irish students to participate in Erasmus Plus. And there are various reasons behind this. And one of them seems to be a negative perception regarding the usefulness of going onto a European partner country instead of an English-speaking country, such as the US or Australia or the UK. There seem to be some insecurities regarding the language requirements in participating in Erasmus+. So there is a communication issue with some student thinking, I cannot go to a specific country if I do not speak the language. And which courses are, that there are courses that are offered in English and what can I do? So it's an advertisement communication issue there. As well as a lack of confidence in their language skills that again ties into it. If they already have some skills in the language, they still feel not confident enough and they will experience some anxiety about going there. And interestingly, there's also concerns around the financial impact. And this is not something that ties so much into the first point about people favoring English-speaking countries, because obviously the financial aspect going to America would be quite different and higher than going to a European partner country. But this is more for students who struggle financially anyway. So they rather not go at all than going there because they're not sure about what the costs are involved. Again, it's a communication. They have real concerns about that. So they rather choose to stay at home and compensate of some sort if they can. In the higher education sector, the existing language competences and the familiarity with certain languages and cultures are largely reflected also in the outward mobilities. So of undergraduate students, staff mobilities are a different story here. And so the largest numbers would go to traditional Erasmus country like Spain, France, Germany, and Italy. These are the big ones. Eastern and Central Eastern European countries receive proportionally more Erasmus participants from the other education sectors. So there's generally a bigger or greater openness in the other education sectors to explore partnerships in Romania, in Slovakia, wherever, and to go there. Georgia comes to mind. There was one project going to Georgia. Then higher education, in the higher education sector. So it would be great if it becomes a bit more setback and options are explored for students also to go to these countries and to communicate again that the language is not the first instance there, but that the other countries also have a lot to offer in terms of contents for their courses and programs. So the lack of foreign languages, particularly in the further education sector, and the further education sector is now comprising adult education and vocational training here for all intents and purposes. That's a particular kind of point. And the over-reliance on English do not only affect the personal interactions and the personal development of people, but also on an institutional level and the Irish Knowledge Society by and large, as they prevent Irish learners from participating in specialized programs that are unavailable in Ireland. There are courses in programs in partner countries that are quite interesting or would be quite interesting for Irish society in general to get this knowledge, to get the back practice there, but there's nobody to take up these kind of places, these mobilities. I was talking, or one of the interviewees is talking about, they had spaces in a horticultural college in France, and they didn't have any learners to send there to fill out these things, and they opted then to send in migrant learners who come originally from Africa, who had the language competences. So yes, ultimately the knowledge came to Ireland, but it is the Irish learners, they didn't have a chance to do so. They're missing a lot of opportunities to go and to bring it back. But the organization really struggled to find somebody able to participate in these courses. And it's a lot of missed opportunities on that sector. So, another broader kind of implications and that are playing here, and this is really in the broader sense, is that participants are generally asked and do overcome what has been referred to by several interviews as the Irish island mentality, and engage more consciously with the world around them and their European neighbors. So getting in touch, going there also fosters a general interest in what is happening politically in the country, but as well as Europe. Where is Ireland's place in the world? How does it relate to the world around them? So that is really interesting things. The mobilities also tend to increase the likelihood of working in an international context or seeking opportunities abroad. So a lot of the participants, or the large majority, vast majority of participants indicated that they are now more likely to work in an international context or even to work in the country of the mobility, where the mobility took them to. So it opened up the perspective. It opened up the notion that that there is something like the single market, that they can move to a different country and work quite easily there if they're up to it. It's a shift in the attitude and in the vision that a lot of the participants have. Then I have to stress that mobilities have not only a lasting impact on the individual, but also on the community behind them, behind each individual, on the family, on friends, neighbors, and so on. It opens up the world. One of the interviewees who works in a school, in a rural school, does talk about it quite significantly. And she says, due to this mobility and the exchange with the students, the families are more open to traveling. They're now regularly visiting the exchange partners in Portugal and France. So it is opening up these kind of things. It sees that learning a language is actually helpful. So parents might be coming around, sending their children. And in this instance, quite significantly, is also this particular interviewee also made a really interesting point. These mobilities can have a fundamental impact with regard to the social and cultural integration of minority groups, and particularly the traveler community, which this particular project really brought to the fore, as they managed over time, because it's an ongoing project, that has been running for years and years in partnerships. And over time, the traveler community, members of the community from the broader community have allowed their children to come along on these exchanges. And these then had a fundamental impact on the children themselves, because they were not perceived as traveler children and Irish children, but abroad they were just perceived as part of the Irish group. So it shifted the language of belonging within these groups, and it fostered a great confidence. And they saw in this particular community a great boost in achievement and integration of their students. And this is all I have for the moment. I thank you very much for your interest.